Conventional wisdom suggests that paying off debt early at the expense of some of your investment money in the short term is a bad trade, unless the debt you're carrying is a high enough interest rate debt like credit cards. The thinking is, why would anyone want to pay off debts with 4, 5, or 6% interest rates when they could instead invest that extra payment money into the markets and earn 7 to 10%? And to be fair, there are certainly instances where that logic makes a lot of sense. I know the title of this video is pretty black and white, but that's mainly because, at least from what I've seen, the discussion surrounding this particular topic is often presented in a very clear-cut way, and I just feel that there's a bit more nuance to this particular decision that often gets lost in translation. Today, I'm going to be going over 4 reasons why I feel, in certain situations, paying off even lower interest debt can be the better approach, even if it does mean giving up some investment returns in the short run. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to my Patreon page. This is the best way to show your support for this channel, and in addition to that, you can also get early access to new videos and exclusive content such as spreadsheets based off the ideas we discuss in these videos. The spreadsheets will allow you to play with your own numbers and see how big of a difference some of the ideas we discuss can make for your own personal financial situation. The first reason why I believe paying off debt early can be the superior approach is that it's one of the few ways you can generate guaranteed returns on your money. Market investments like stocks are very volatile in the short run. They're also often highly skewed, meaning that the long-term averages may not actually paint an accurate picture of the kinds of returns you'll likely to see in any given month or year. So if you're in a situation where you could attack your debts with a vengeance and get them paid off in a reasonably short period of time, say a few months or even a year, if not less, there's a decent chance that you won't actually be losing out on much gains at all. For instance, on your screen now, you'll see a chart of the average yearly total return of some of the most common asset classes that people put their money into. You'll also see what percentage of years the asset class managed to produce returns of at least 4% since 1972. And as you can see, while the average returns are all above 4%, with some even cracking into double digits, depending on the asset you're looking at, there's anywhere from a 30 to 50% chance that it'll earn less than a nominal 4% in any given year before taxes and expenses. And even the assets like stocks and real estate, which have, historically anyway, hit that 4% mark more often than the rest, they can have major down years. Both lost some 37% in their worst years, according to this dataset. So while the majority of the time the investment would out-earn the interest paid on the debt, it's far from a guarantee. Whereas paying off a debt with a 4% interest rate is a guaranteed return of 4%. Obviously, if the debt you were looking to pay off had an interest rate of higher than 4%, which is not altogether uncommon, especially if you don't have a very strong credit score, then the likelihood of the investment outperforming the returns you would get from paying off the debt would decrease, at least to some extent. Just to illustrate that, here are the results if we filtered the returns for at or above 6% and 8% respectively. Beyond the interest rate, the other key factor to consider here is the time it would take you to pay off the debt early if you decided to take that approach. The longer the payoff period, the more likely it is that the investment approach will be able to outperform. This is why it's important to do everything within your power to get out of debt quickly. It limits the opportunity cost you're paying by choosing to delay investing. It's also why the invest versus paying off debt conversation rarely considers mortgage debt. Because at least from a purely mathematical perspective regarding returns, in most cases, the length of time it would take you to pay off a new mortgage is long enough that you'd almost always be better off going with a well-diversified portfolio of investments. The second reason why paying off debt early can sometimes be the superior approach is that it oftentimes requires a fairly aggressive investing strategy in order to get much excess benefit out of it. As we saw a minute ago, stocks and REITs were the two clear winners in terms of earning a high enough return to justify investing in them instead of taking the guaranteed return of paying off debt. And once you got past those really low interest rate loans, they were basically the only viable options that provided much better than a coin flip odds chance of out-earning the guaranteed returns of paying down those medium interest loans. However, they're also two of the more volatile asset classes in the short term. Take a look at these return distribution graphs. They each show the annualized total returns of stocks and REITs. The data for stocks goes back to 1871 and is based on Robert Shiller's estimates for the total return of the S&P 500. And the data for REITs goes back to 1972 and is based off a combination of estimated returns produced by the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts and some Vanguard index fund data. REITs took losses about once every 5 years in this sample. Stocks saw it happen about once every 4 years, and both had multiple years of worse than 20% losses and better than 30% gains. In fact, for stocks, getting better than 30% returns was almost the most common outcome. And that's awesome if you happen to be investing in those years, because in those instances you likely could substantially make up for the interest that you're paying on your debts and come out ahead. However, if you're unlucky enough to be investing in one of the years that takes a loss, it can be fairly devastating. It could potentially wipe out much, if not all, of the benefits that you were hoping to get by investing while paying minimums on your debts. And the fact is, not everyone's in a position where they're comfortable investing in a strategy that's heavily weighted in these more volatile assets. And unfortunately for those individuals, as we just saw, history suggests that a fairly aggressive strategy is almost required if you want to have much better than a coin flip odds of out earning all but the lowest interest debts over the short term that you would be actually paying them off. I guess what I'm trying to get at with these 2 points is that the thing we need to keep in mind is not the difference between the long-term historical average returns of an investment and the interest rates on our debts, but rather that we should ask ourselves 3 questions. First, how long would it take us to realistically pay off the debts we're considering paying off early if we did everything in our power to knock them out as quickly as possible, such as working overtime, living frugally during the payoff period, selling so many things that the kids think they're next, and putting the proceeds into debt payments? Second, based on that estimated payoff period, what does history suggest the range of returns could be over a period of that length? And third, is the risk of underperforming the guaranteed returns of paying off our debts, possibly by quite substantial amounts, especially if something happens to us in our income during that time frame, worth the most likely outcome we expect to see if we invest and just pay the minimums? In other words, if we determine that based on the time period we think it would take us to pay off our debts, our investments would likely generate about 7% for us, and our debts have an interest rate of 4%, is that 3% spread worth the risk of the investments underperforming and losing 10, 20, or even 30%, or seeing ourselves lose our incomes temporarily and go further into debt while having to sell off the investments? If we're paying off a $5,000 or $10,000 loan that we expect to be able to knock out inside of a year, then the difference in real dollar terms from that 3% spread may be pretty darn small and thus probably not worth the risk. However, if we're paying off a $50,000 or $60,000 loan over the course of several years, then the risk-reward equation may be different. I hope that makes sense. The third reason why I believe paying off debts early can be the superior approach is that it can increase your savings rate sooner while lowering your burn rate. We all know how important having a high savings rate is to things like achieving financial independence. In fact, it's generally even more important than earning high returns on our money, but it can also help you to make up for some growth that you missed while you were paying off debts. Here's a simplified example of how this works. Let's say that John and Jane each have a $3,000 personal loan to a family member. The family member is charging them 3% interest, and the loan is to be paid back in full in no more than 5 years. Therefore, our minimum payment is a little under $54 a month. John and Jane each have an extra $250 a month after minimum payments are made and expenses are covered. John will invest it. Jane will use it to pay off the debt. For the sake of simplicity, we'll be ignoring the other things that John and Jane could be doing to supercharge their situation, like adopting a more frugal lifestyle, even if only temporarily, and selling things to bring in more cash. I'll also be ignoring the unexpected things that could come up, such as unexpected medical bills or a job loss. I'll cover that in the next section. Anyway, assuming John and Jane's investments earned a consistent 6% per year, which, as we just went over, is unrealistic, but I'm trying to keep things simple for now, here's how the two situations would shake out. As you can see, since Jane paid off her debt early, she was able to invest a little bit more money each month from then on than John was, which helped her to narrow the gap between their net worth figures. John does still come out ahead in this simplified example, which makes sense because he was earning 6% per year consistently on his investments compared to Jane earning an early return of 3% while she was paying off her debt, but his victory is by an incredibly small margin of only 13 cents. If you ask me, that's basically a wash from a growth perspective. But that's how the increased savings rate from paying off debts early can make up, at least in part, for the benefit you get from earning a higher return on the investments than you would pay in interest. And sometimes when we think that through, that can change the risk-reward equation enough to make us change up our approach. This is especially true when you consider other things that could come into play. If, for instance, Jane did change her behavior, even if only temporarily, in order to get out of debt as fast as humanly possible, that could further change the risk-reward equation. As we discussed earlier, outside of examining the most likely return spread you're anticipating earning when investing over paying off debt, arguably the most important other factor to take into consideration is how long it'll take you to pay off those debts, if you tried to knock them out as quickly as you could. Jane knows that paying off debts early works best when those debts are paid off as fast as humanly possible, because the longer it takes you, the more growth you're potentially missing out on from the higher long-term returns typically generated by investments. This knowledge can be quite the motivating factor for those who are taking the debt payoff route. And this is one of the reasons why you'll often see those who are really serious about trying to get out of debt selling basically everything they own. If Jane had sold a bunch of things in order to get out of debt faster and earned, say, $500 based on our previous simplified example, here's how that example would change. Now you might be thinking to yourself, couldn't John also sell things and then put that money into his investments? And the answer is, yeah, he absolutely could. And some people do. But it's not nearly as common to see these kinds of material behavior changes from those who are investing while paying minimums on their debts as it is for those who are trying to get out of debts as quickly as possible. Because when you get right down to it, it comes down to the individual in question. If John is one of those few who is going to change his lifestyle in order to invest more, potentially so that he can reach financial independence earlier on in life, this particular factor in the invest versus pay off debt equation is largely irrelevant, since his behavior would be basically the same either way. Because he's essentially treating the gap between his current net worth and the net worth he needs to have to be financially independent as a sort of form of pseudo-debt. The point is, if one path is going to spark behavioral changes that the other one isn't, especially if that behavioral change is likely to last after the debt is gone, such as for those who became more highly skilled budgeters in the payoff process, then it should be factored into the equation, because it can make a significant difference in a lot of cases. If the behavior is likely to be the same for you either way, then it doesn't really make a difference. The fourth reason why I believe paying off debts early can be the superior approach is that it can better set you up to manage unforeseen events or emergencies. Look, life happens. I think if recent history has taught us nothing else, it has taught us that. Repeatedly. And if something unfortunate happens to someone who chooses to invest instead of paying off debts, that can make them have to sell some of those investments in order to get by, potentially during a time when the market is down, as it so often is when life happens. This could cost them much of their long-term benefit that they were supposed to get by investing instead of paying off debts. Beyond this, they may not be as capable of suddenly cutting costs and/or finding other ways to increase income as someone who's been experimenting with ways to do both in an effort to get out of debt quickly, so that they can minimize the opportunity costs of being out of the market. This can further cut into those benefits of investing for the spread, for those who would see those material behavioral changes by choosing one path over the other. So with all those things to take into consideration, let's run a few simulations to get an idea of how they tend to work using more realistic returns. For all scenarios, I'll be assuming that John and Jane have a $30,000 10-year student loan with a 4.5% interest rate. They'll have a $5,000 a month income and $3,000 a month in expenses outside of the minimum payments on their debts. If they find themselves unable to cover their expenses for one reason or another, they will have to pay for things with their credit card, which will carry an 18% interest rate. Their company will provide a 50% match on up to 6% of their income if they choose to invest it. And the returns on their investments will be randomly generated each month from the historical monthly total returns of Vanguard's original S&P 500 index fund. I will simulate each scenario 100 times and take the average ending net worth figure for John and Jane to determine which approach was best and, more importantly, by how much. Here are the results of the 6 different scenarios. The basic scenario assumes no unforeseen events or changes come up. The only difference between the two approaches is that after investing up to the match, John pays the minimum on his debts and invests the rest, while Jane attempts to pay off her debts early and then starts to invest with everything she's got. The sell investments scenario starts both John and Jane off with $10,000. John invests the $10,000 right away, whereas Jane uses it to pay off a large portion of her debt. Both still invest up to the match each month. The no-match scenario is the same as the basic scenario, except that Jane doesn't invest anything until her debts are fully paid off. So she is missing out on the match, but is able to pay off her debts a little bit faster. John, obviously, still gets the full match. The job loss event scenario has both John and Jane losing their job for 6 months at the start of the second year of the scenario. In addition to completely losing their income, their expenses will drop by 15% since they no longer have the daily commute to work. Both are once again investing up to the match when they're able to. The behavioral changes event scenario sees Jane adopt a more frugal lifestyle for the first year of the simulation, cutting her non-debt related expenses by 25%. She also increases her income by working some extra shifts and selling some of her possessions. The sales generate $1,000 for her in the first month of the simulation, but nothing after that. And the overtime increases her income by 15% for the first year of the simulation, and then again, nothing after that. As mentioned earlier, for some people, this particular apples to oranges comparison may not actually be a realistic reflection of how their personal tendencies would play out. And if that's you, take this scenario and the next one with a pretty darn big grain of salt. The combo event scenario simply sees Jane adopt those behavioral changes in addition to her and John losing their jobs for 6 months at the start of year 2. Now, since the returns here are being randomly generated based on historical data, we do have to take the exact figures here with a bit of a grain of salt. But the trends should still be able to give us some insights to take away. And the main insight that I took away from this is that even if the debt has an interest rate that's lower than what we would expect to typically earn from our investments, like this one was, paying it off early is still probably, more often than not, a decent idea. At the very least, if you're attacking the debt with a vengeance and getting rid of it as quickly as possible, you're not likely to lose very much ground compared to someone who simply paid the minimums and invested. In fact, you may actually come out ahead. If the returns on the investments during your payoff period are not enough to make up for the interest that you saved, the additional income that you have available for future investing, any potential financial skills you picked up along the way, and or the intangible benefits associated with lowering your burn rate and financial risk sooner. As always, if you want to play around with some of the scenarios for yourself, the spreadsheet that I used to make this video is available on my Patreon page for those in the investor tier and above. You can find a link to that in the description below this video. But what do you think? Are there situations in which paying off debt early can actually be a good move? Or is the potential for lost growth in the markets too much to pass up even in the short term? Let me know in the comments section below. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.